Greetings, Saturday, July 18th, 2020. I got to sleep in. I walked the dog, sat around and played on YouTube, watched videos, walked the dog some more, took the dog to the dog park, came home, took a wonderful nap. Just finished walking the dog, and she's laying here behind me chewing on a rawhide bone, which she loves to do. So if you hear all this munching and nom, 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 that's the dog having the time of her life chewing a bone sitting next to me. She always wants to sit next to me when she does that. So I've learned to just ignore it. Ignore the sound because I just hear it constantly because she has this whole chewing thing that she needs to do all the time. So the topic for today, somebody was asking me, how did I end up in Mexico? It's a long, complicated story, and if you want to read the full-length version of it, there is a book out that my sister and my mom wrote called Tortillas and Peanut Butter that actually ended up on the bestseller on Amazon, and it went into print, so you can actually buy a copy of it, too. It came out 2-3 years ago now. My sister did it originally for... My mother, while living in Mexico, wrote... My sister was in the United States. My mother was in Mexico. So there's a big age difference between my sister. She was off to college, basically, when all this happened back in 1968. So my mother would write my sister weekly a letter chronicling her life in Mexico. And my sister saved all those letters, gave them to my mom. I've read all those letters. My mother has an outrageous sense of humor, and they're lengthy letters, so they're like little stories. And then my sister surprised my mother a few years ago my mother had written a book about her experiences in Mexico right when we first came to the United States, and there was interest in publishing it. They wanted it, I think, to be a little bit longer. And my mother just said, you know what? Maybe when I'm gone, one of you can pick up this project. Well, my sister picked up the project and published the book with more stuff in there, expanding the book some. And I thought it was a self-published book on Amazon. I thought, who's going to read this? This is a story about my family and me growing up in Mexico, my brother, and nobody's going to be really interested in it. And little did we know that it ended up being a bestseller. So there is a book out there chronicling this. It's a very funny book because my mother has an outrageous sense of humor, as does my sister. And the way she wrote it, she took the letters and basically made a narrative out of it. It's a good book. Reading it for me is like a chronicle of my childhood, because basically, my first memories were in Mexico, because I was about to turn 3, and I turned my birthday's in September, so actually about 42 years ago, I'm sorry, 42, I'm not that young, 52 years ago is when my mother went to Mexico. So what caused it? The vacuum cleaner broke down. Yes, it was due to a vacuum cleaner malfunction that I ended up growing up in Mexico. I was born in the Chicago area, or in Chicago, basically in Hinsdale. That was the hospital that I was born in. And my first baby years, first 2 baby years, was in LaGrange, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. Obviously, my mother and my father had a bad marriage. My mother never talked ill of my father growing up. So I got to form my own conclusions of him when I was an adult. So bless my mother for never talking ill about my father growing up. He was just this person that I knew that was my father. And, visitations weren't really a thing like they are now. Back then when people divorced. It also didn't help that he was in the United States and then my mother was in Mexico, so there was added distance too. But as my father later told me on in life, as an adult, he said, it was right that your mother raised you guys, because my generation a single father, no, it just wouldn't happen. Keep in mind, my father was born, I think it was in 1917. He was the youngest of 4 kids. And his parents were considerably older. They were born in I think it was 1879 and 1880. So I always said my father was very Victorian in the way he thought, because his parents were basically from the Victorian era. They had emigrated to the United States from what is far northern Italy, right at the border of Italy and Austria. There's a region called Tireland, or Tirol. And my father's from, they came from this rural hamlet, not even a village, a hamlet called Comasine, like population 50 or 65 people. And it's still that population. It's this tiny hamlet up in the middle of the Alps. Anyway, So my father had this very old-fashioned worldview. My mother was from the Chicago area with a very sophisticated modern view. She was descendant of very progressive thinking parents. My grandmother, on my mother's side, was a suffragette, basically. She really believed in women's rights and the women's right to vote, and the minute the vote became available, she voted. And so my mother was basically a feminist before the term even existed. How she ended up in this marriage with my father, who was so completely a polar opposite, is a story unto itself. But needless to say, they were married for about 17 years. But my father was very tight with his money. He admitted it later on, and he confirmed it as an adult, that he was very, and demanding of his. He wanted a wife to be like a Victorian wife, stay at home, raise the kids, don't work, the whole concept. And my mother worked part-time, worked for a newspaper as a columnist who became syndicated, won press awards. And so there was this conflict in their marriage, but he was very tight-fisted with money. And so everything in the house, she said, you'd have to use it till it broke down. And this particular day, he'd gone off to work. That had an argument that morning about whatever it was. And she went to go vacuum, and the vacuum cleaner broke down, and she had it. Because she knew that he was going to somehow blame her for the vacuum cleaner breaking down, saying, you didn't take care of it enough, or you didn't, whatever it would be, he'd blame her for it. It was not a good relationship. She'd had it. She had always saved cash, a little bit of cash, and kept it for herself in case of necessity. So she grabbed the cash, 2 kids, suitcases. She said she was so angry that morning because she knew what was going to happen later on that day, and she just did not want to confront him. Grabbed her $262 in cash, packed up 2 kids, and then decided to go over to my grandmother's house to drop us off because she just needed a break. She was just going to drop us off and then go for a drive or do something to just get her mind off of everything. So she realized her mind was spinning and really just showing up at her mother's house all in a tizzy wouldn't be fair to her mom, my grandmother. So she decided to go ahead and take that drive. She said her mind was racing. She was reevaluating her marriage and all the things that had gone wrong. They had separated at one point, but they were back together. It just was not working out. And she said, next thing I knew, because she got jumped on Interstate 55 that goes out of Chicago. She was going to drive into the countryside just to clear her mind. But her mind was racing, and all of a sudden, she said, it was like I came to, and I realized I was crossing the Mississippi River. She'd driven several hours out of Chicago, heading towards St. Louis. And she said, all of a sudden, it was like I came to the minute I was crossing that bridge of the Mississippi River into St. Louis. She's like, oh my God, I can't believe I drove all the way out here. And she said the minute she crossed the Mississippi, it was her Rubicon. She realized, I do not have to go back to that marriage. I do not have to go back. So what do I do? She had friends in LA, so she decided she was going to go to LA. My mother has been, always will be, and she will admit to it, a horrible map reader. So she buys a map to try to plot how to get out to LA driving. And she kind of plots a route, and she goes, well, I could just swing down through Dallas. I could visit Dallas. I've always wanted to visit Dallas instead of going to Oklahoma straight across to Amarillo, just so she says she could be in Dallas. So she, needless to say, notified everybody that she wasn't going home, and plotted her trip down to Dallas. And the following day, she drove from St. Louis to Dallas, got to Dallas, looked at her map again. And of course, back then, if you remember, maps were all on one page, so because she bought a United States atlas book or map book. So, Arkansas looks the same size as Texas. Rhode Island looks the same size as Texas on those maps. And she's not a good map reader, so she decided she might, Mexico doesn't look that far from Dallas, going down to Laredo. I might just go over there and just so I can cross into Mexico and see what it was like, just to say I could go. Because back then you didn't have to have a passport. You could just literally go across the border. Of course, she said, by the time I got to San Antonio, I realized this was a long drive. And then she realized it was 3 more hours, but she'd already invested like 5 hours of driving. She said, oh, hell with it. I'll go down to Laredo. And then pick up my route and go back to LA. Anyhow, she went down to Laredo the following day, spent the night, crossed into Nuevo Laredo, which, as I have always described Laredo and Nuevo Laredo, especially back then, is the armpit of Mexico. It's the ugliest city. Laredo on the U.S. side is ugly too. Nuevo Laredo, the new Laredo on the Mexican side, is just as ugly. She was like really thoroughly disappointed because she had imagined Mexican culture was very different. But somebody there said, oh, well, if you want to get a taste of Mexico, a real taste of Mexico, there's a city about 3 hours south from here called Saltillo. And that's very colonial. And you can, the downtown, and you get a true sense of Mexico. So the following day, she decided, well, I'm already all the way down here. I might as well drive to Saltillo. So she drove to Saltillo, and it is a beautiful city. This downtown is very colonial. And she was like, wow, this is really cool. She really liked it. And she was like, I want to see more of Mexico. And someone mentioned, oh, well, if you like Saltillo, she ran across someone. She said, well, if you think Saltillo is beautiful, you need to drive down to San Miguel de Allende, which is not too far from where I grew up. So you get the idea of how we're getting there. She got to San Miguel de Allende. And of course, now San Miguel de Allende, the downtown area of San Miguel de Allende is now a World Heritage Site because it's so pristine and beautiful with this 18th century architecture. It's like a living museum. If you see ever pictures of San Miguel de Allende, you would think you're in the middle of Europe, in a colonial city in Europe. Well, she fell in love with San Miguel de Allende, and she was like, just wandered and stayed an extra day there because it is a magnificent city. A small city, more like a town, but to this day, it remains a big tourist attraction in Mexico, and a lot of foreigners go there. A lot of Americans go there to vacation. But she realized her finances weren't going to carry her out to LA and then back to Chicago. And she realized going back to Chicago, would be sort of like going back to the life she had, even though she didn't really want to be back with my dad and she was trying to get a new fresh start. But at the same time, the disappointment of, I've got to go back. And so she was in a little cafe in San Miguel de Allende that morning, after realizing her budget was what she had in cash was not going to get her to LA and back to, go to LA and then back to Chicago from San Miguel de Allende. She would have to head on back to Chicago, and she really didn't want to do that. And she said she started to cry in that cafe. Now, there's a lot of, in San Miguel de Allende, nearby is Guanajuato, which is a big university city and also World Heritage Site, gorgeous city. My favorite city in Mexico is Guanajuato. But there's a lot of Americans in that area because of their tourism. And so she was sitting there at the cafe crying, and there was a bulletin board. You know how you've seen this probably around college campuses. There's a bulletin board like apartment for rent. I need a dog sitter, somebody to clean house, all kinds of stuff with the phone numbers, that you rip off the phone number because this is pre-internet times. And she saw a sign in English that said, wanted English teachers. No experience necessary, but must be native speakers or something like that. In other words, they wanted an American to teach advanced conversational English at a school. And they wanted somebody that was preferably a teacher, but if not, at least American. Ripped the phone number, called the number, and it was in Toluca, another city a couple of hours away. Called them up, interviewed for the job, and got the job in Toluca, Mexico. And her life started all over again. So that is how she ended up, and therefore I and my brother ended up in Mexico. So because of a vacuum cleaner. Now, I think of my mother now, she was 38, I guess, at the time when this happened. I don't know if I could just uproot my life and go to a foreign country with kids and start all over again. I mean, the courage it took to do that. And how bad was the marriage that she was willing to do that? But I mean, it's just fascinating, the independent and courageous spirit she has. And so that's how I ended up in Mexico, because of a vacuum cleaner breaking down. And the rest, as we say, is history. So that's kind of like a quick synopsis of all of that. And reading her letters that she wrote on her road trip, because she was writing daily at first. You can read understand what she was going through. Because, we forget now how oppressed women were and the expectations women were supposed to live under. And when you have an intelligent, bright, educated woman who very autonomous in spirit, living in a society that was so oppressing her. And even though Mexico was much more backwards as far as women's rights were back then, the fact that she was a foreigner in this country, she was a curiosity. And so because she was not Mexican, she was American, people offered her a little bit more of a chance to be who she was. Because the expectation of, well, she's not one of us, so we can't impose our cultural norms on her. And so she was able to flourish in this machista culture. She had to deal with machismo, then she didn't, but in a different way than a Mexican woman would have. And she became very successful while living in Mexico. So as a teacher at that school, and then eventually they opened a second branch in Irapuato, and she went over there to teach and then took over the school. And if you see my other video about the bat incident at her school, created a very successful institution for higher learning there, basically out of her own wit and gumption. So that's the story. Updating COVID, because I'm continuing with the updates on COVID. Dallas every day this week was well over into the thousands, per 1,000 per day or more than 1,000 per day. The deadliest week in Dallas. We've broken 40,000 cases in Dallas. Our population is 2.8 million, so that gives you an idea of 40,000 out of 2.8 million is quite a few people. We're talking over 1% of the population in Dallas County has been exposed to COVID or has had it, and it's spreading. It's spreading like wildfire. I have a friend that works at the hospital, and even today he was saying he was feeling overwhelmed with just having to pronounce COVID deaths because he's working in that area, and it's you could tell by his posting today and his message that he put out today that it's even he's feeling overwhelmed by it. So, but we have, since our government has basically not taken on any responsibility for protecting us, we have to do it on our own. So he keeps begging people to wear masks. And so I'm doing the same too. Wear your mask, guys. It's horrible out there. And I get a taste of it because I've had to work with COVID patients that have recovered and going into the hospitals too. So I've seen it firsthand. Not the COVID wards, but the ex-COVID patients that are maimed by their disease. Because that's the thing that's not getting reported as much. This disease, for people that are healthy, with no pre-existing conditions under 50, it is a Russian roulette. People, you might have heard the term COVID stroke. It's very real, and it's affecting people kind of randomly, these strokes, but it's doing it to the younger group of people. So yes, they may not die, but they're permanently disabled due to the disease, and it's happening at an alarming rate. So it's not just a death sentence that, even though the death rate is low, it's this other that is so frightening. So wear your mask, guys. All right, I'm going to finish up the video. Have a good evening if you watch this tonight. If you watch this tomorrow or during the day or during the afternoon, have a good afternoon or good evening. And keep wearing them masks.